So hello everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Carolina Grimberg-Olihov, and I'm the Human Rights Law and Research Officer at the Jerusalem Institute of Justice. As part of our collaboration with ALMA, I would like to welcome you to our webinar of today, Echoes of Conflict, Antisemitism in Europe Amid Israel-Hamas War. The Jerusalem Institute of Justice, JIJ, is an Israeli legal and research institute that holds special consultative status at the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations for its contribution to the promotion and protection of human rights in Israel and in the Middle East. The International Law and Public Diplomacy Department actively engages with the UN, its special procedure bodies, the ICRC, the EU, and other states and institutions to advocate for the respect of international law. In line with our dedication to collaborative initiatives promoting awareness and respect for international law, JIJ has partnered with ALMA, the Association for the Promotion of International Humanitarian Law, to co-host this insightful webinar. ALMA, established in 2010, is an apolitical non-profit association dedicated to enhancing awareness of international humanitarian law, IHL. ALMA's primary goal is to make IHL knowledge accessible to all and to nurture discussions on its significance and practicality. Now I would like to introduce to our distinguished speakers, Ambassador Daniel Meron and Dr. Aleksandra Gliszcyńska-Grabias. Ambassador Daniel Meron is the Deputy Director General for Europe at the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Jerusalem. Prior to that, he was the COVID-19 project manager at the ministry. Daniel Meron was Israel's ambassador to Czechia between 2017 and 2021. Ambassador Meron served as diplomat also in Nicosia, Oslo, Washington, D.C., where he was the liaison between the Israeli government and the U.S. Congress. Amongst his positions in Jerusalem, he was a foreign policy advisor to the 7th President of Israel, Israel Weizmann, and the head of the UN and International Organizations Bureau at the MFA. Daniel Meron holds an LLM in International Law from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and is a member of the Israel Bar Association. Dr. Aleksandra Gliszcyńska-Grabias is an assistant professor at the Institute of Law Studies in the Polish Academy of Sciences and a member of the Board of Governors of the International Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists. She specializes in legal tools for fighting antisemitism and xenophobia, freedom of speech, and vulnerable groups' rights. She's co-editor and co-author of Constitutionalism Under Stress and Law and Memory Towards Legal Governance and History. She held numerous fellowships, including at the University of Cambridge, Yale University, and the European University Institute, and she is a principal investigator in International Research Consortium, The Challenge of Populist Memory, Politics for Europe, Towards Effective Responses to Militant Legislation on the Past, sponsored by the Volkswagen Stiftung. Today, we're going to discuss how the impact of the Israel-Hamas war has expanded all the way through Europe, affecting not only the relationship between Israel and the EU and also European states, but also the relationship between Jewish communities with Europe and its states. Today marks the 52nd day after the terrible attack committed by Hamas on October 7th. To this day, still, almost 200 individuals are still held hostage in the Gaza Strip. Over 7,000 people have been injured, and more than 1,200 lives have been lost. In addition to this, and because we're also talking about Europe, it's worth to mention that synagogues, Holocaust memorials, Jewish schools, Jewish cemeteries, and historic Jewish state sites in locations such as Barcelona, Berlin, Vienna, Rome, and Thessaloniki have been targets of attacks, often accompanied by anti-Israel and anti-Semitic graffiti, including swastikas. A particularly distressing incident took place on November 4, when a 30-year-old Jewish woman was stabbed in her home in Lyon, and her attacker defaced her door with a swastika symbol. I will now proceed to ask some questions to our speakers, and following that, we will open the floor for a 10 to 15-minute Q&A session. So all attendees are welcome to leave your questions in the Q&A section below. And I will in the end proceed to ask those questions to our speakers. So to start this discussion, and before we delve into the specific events of October 7 and what happened in Europe after October 7, I want to discuss and open the topic of the concept of anti-Semitism. So many countries, including, for instance, Belgium, France, and Spain, have adopted the working definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA, which defines anti-Semitism as a certain perception of Jews, which might be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jews or non-Jews, individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. This is how the IHRA defines anti-Semitism, and it also provides some examples of specific incidents that fall under these definitions. For example, applying double standards by requiring of Israel a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation, or also drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. So I would like to start with Ambassador Meron, and I would like to ask both of you, and I will start with Ambassador Meron, what would you categorize as anti-Semitism, both in law and in diplomacy, taking in consideration the IHRA definition or other definitions of anti-Semitism?
Thank you very much, Carolina. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you for the Jerusalem Institute of Justice and to the ALMA IHL for organizing this very timely webinar. I think it's very relevant to have a webinar this evening, this time, about anti-Semitism, when we see anti-Semitism growing rapidly in Europe, around the world, more than we've seen in many, many years. And now, what do I see as anti-Semitism? I see anti-Semitism, I think the working definition of anti-Semitism of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is known as IHRA, is a good definition. It's not an Israeli definition, but it's something that I think is very helpful. And where it says that the anti-Semitism, as you were quoting before, is a perception of Jews, a rhetorical and physical manifestation of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and of property towards community institutions and religious facilities. I'm sorry, I skipped a word. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. In this definition is also a double standard towards Israel. Now, we are seeing a lot of that. And I want to give one example which illustrates this, which is a very clear example. It is in the many demonstrations that we see across Europe these days, the slogan "From the river to the sea, free Palestine." And what does that mean? That means there won't be any country, there won't be any Israel anymore. So the Jewish state cannot exist. This undermines the existence of Jews having their own state, the state of Israel, and this is definitely very anti-Semitic. Unfortunately, there are many countries that don't allow these slogans, these calls to exist in such demonstrations, but some countries do allow it, and that is something that we need to fight against and not allow the spread of anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews, hatred of Israel. So I would like to start with that and maybe mention another definition, which I always like to quote, and that is of a great Israeli leader, Natan Sharansky, the freedom fighter, who said that for him, anti-Semitism is the 3 Ds: the delegitimization of Jews, of Israel, the demonization, and the double standards. So that, in his words, puts a very clear and easy to remember definition. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Gliszcyńska-Grabias.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation and for organizing this webinar. I like to refer to anti-Semitism, quoting Professor Wistrich, Robert Wistrich, who called anti-Semitism the longest hatred. I also find the IRA definition and Sharansky's definition very useful, but this perhaps a bit poetic description of the longest hatred also has its important implications, because it's manifest, it shows that anti-Semitism is of course a form of racism, xenophobia, etc., but it's I would claim a distinct form of this kinds of prejudice and hatred. And it also has, this fact has strong legal implications. But when it comes to the legal definition, I think it's important to note that both the IRA and Sharansky's definition, of course, they have different status and character, but both of them are also not legal definitions. And in international human rights law, we do not have one binding general description, definition of anti-Semitism, of the phenomenon of anti-Semitism. And there are, of course, advantages and disadvantages of this fact. But I think that like every definition, to some extent, limits the scope of the notion that we are using. So with this, what we are witnessing right now when it comes to anti-Semitism, everyday new forms, new emerging forms and manifestations of it, sometimes unthinkable, having a legal definition would to some extent limit our possibilities to counteract it with the legal tools. But we, in international human rights law, and in particular in the case law of international courts like the European Court of Human Rights here in Europe, we have some indications of how to define and understand anti-Semitism. But of course, the most complex and controversial issue concerns this thin red line between anti-Semitism in the form of, for example, Holocaust denial or pro-Nazi statements, and the so-called new forms of anti-Semitism now emerging as actually hatred against Israel and anti-Zionism. So here I see a very big challenge, important challenge also for legal scholars and legal practitioners. And I will perhaps add just one thing, that this is a challenge, but also challenging is a phenomenon that I observe of the denial and counterclaim, saying that anti-Zionism and hatred towards Israel expressed now is never anti-Semitic and cannot be anti-Semitic because this is only expressed in defense of Palestinian rights, etc. So it's equally dangerous actually to deny the claim that such forms of anti-Israeli attitudes can be anti-Semitic. They can be anti-Semitic, and they very often are.
Thank you. Yes, I think you both raised something very important, which is the legitimization and denial of the right to exist of Israel, and many use that as to say, no, we're not anti-Semitic, we're just anti-Israel, as if there was a difference, and many times, as you just said, there isn't. So now I would like to proceed to another question, which is also to put a bit of context. I mean, you just said also, Dr. Gliszcyńska-Grabias, that anti-Semitism is the oldest hate. So we know that anti-Semitism is not something new. It hasn't raised from October 7, and it also didn't end with the Holocaust. And it is an ongoing challenge in all around the world and also in Europe. And many times the frustration within the Jewish communities is often associated with perceived challenges in Israel's advocacy efforts, also known as Hasbara. So Ambassador Meron, before the current conflict, what initiatives do you think that Israel took to address anti-Semitism in Europe? And from your perspective, how would you assess the effectiveness of these initiatives?
Well, of course, Israel raised the voice against anti-Semitism and against the racism wherever we can. And we have partners that do this. And one of the partners is the European Union. And they have been in the last few years quite active. In 2015, Katharina von Schnurbein was appointed as the special coordinator of the European Commission to combat anti-Semitism. This is a good opportunity to commend the important work that Katharina does and raise the voice of not only anti-Semitism and also fostering Jewish life in Europe. And she works for legislation in Europe and of action. One of the things that passed in 2 years ago in Europe was the EU strategy on combating anti-Semitism, which was planned for 10 years, from 2021 to 2030, on how to do that and how to fight against anti-Semitism, not only anti-Semitism in the street, in the public domain, but also online. This is one of the most serious problems that we see, the online anti-Semitism and hatred, which continues and has increased recently. And there's a working group to combat anti-Semitism in Europe. And one of the recent acts that was passed in Europe was the Digital Services Act, the DSA, and it was adopted last year. And this now the major social media platforms are obligated to remove anti-Semitic content. The question is how to see that this is really done. So this is a very important tool that we have, the DSA. Another place where we're active to make sure this there is a voice against anti-Semitism and is in the European Parliament and in parliaments across Europe. I can give you the example when I was ambassador in Prague, and there was a sale of Nazi memorabilia in stores. So together with the ambassador of Germany, we went to the parliament and we spoke about it, and they legislated against this and made it out. They outlawed such sales of memorabilia. So that's an example of things that we do. And basically, we call on governments to adopt the IRA definition, and we try to raise the voice whenever we see such acts. So that's my short answer.
Thank you. So now also in relation to all these, the concerning presence of anti-Semitism in Europe, and we mentioned before, numerous European countries adopted the IRA definition, and now Ambassador Meron also mentioned other initiatives that have been taken in Europe. So my question to you now, Dr. Gliszcyńska-Grabias, is if you could offer an overview, maybe some additional legal tools that both the EU and, if you know, also specific European countries have implemented to address anti-Semitism. And also now Ambassador Meron also raised the issue of online anti-Semitism. So here maybe if you could comment on that, on how does it affect, we have this law, but now how do you assess if some content online is anti-Semitic or not, and how do we ensure legally that this is removed?
Mm-hmm. Well, within the European legal sphere, there are really numerous instruments of various kinds for countering anti-Semitism. It took me 642 pages of my book on legal tools of fighting anti-Semitism to mention them. But at that time, I also included UN mechanisms, which now I would have to really rethink of including at least when it comes to their practical use and implementation. But Mr. Ambassador mentioned extremely important, this latest addition to this whole spectrum of legal instruments concerning anti-Semitism online. This is the most challenging thing ever, to counteract anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred online because of the very form of how disappears there, and also the amount of this content that is just shocking to and difficult to grasp, also for lawyers and law enforcement, not only within Europe, but when we talk about the European legal sphere, we should, as you said, refer to the instruments available here. So there are important instruments embedded in the treaties, European human rights protection treaties, like the European Convention of Human Rights, with anti-discrimination ban, and also the ban on the abuse of rights, which is very important in the context of the abuse of freedom of speech and the limits to freedom of speech that in case of Europe and European legal sphere are situated or placed in a completely different place than is the case with the US and the First Amendment environment, for example. So treaty instruments and mechanisms are extremely important. There are also other instruments. When it comes to the EU law, I would mention here the framework decision on combating certain forms of hate speech and negationism with the tools of law. This was an instrument implemented in 2000 or introduced in 2008 with the obligation of all EU member states to implement its provisions into their national legal systems. And of course, here lies the biggest challenge and problem, like with every legal tool, its proper implementation and effective implementation. And we can say the same when it comes to all these instruments that we are talking about here. I would perhaps stress that I believe European legal system is best prepared to counteract anti-Semitism. It's very coherent. It includes various mechanisms and tools, but again, its implementation is crucial. And the strategy of EU Commission to counteract anti-Semitism, the one that Ambassador mentioned a moment ago, is crucially important here. I haven't had a chance to participate in the works of the working group, but I believe that they should, or perhaps they are doing this. I haven't been following that close, but they for sure should concentrate also on making these legal tools effective. The EU and the EU Commission has all possibilities to really empower the fight against anti-Semitism also legally, and I hope they will be doing this as effective as they or as eager as they have been doing this so far. When it comes to particular EU member states or the Council of wider Europe, so to say, Council of Europe member states, I think it's important to note that all of these countries have legislation embedded in their penal codes, criminal codes, that penalizes various forms of anti-Semitism, hate speech and hate crime. And this is an obligation of the prosecutors of these states, then judges of the states, to really deal with these forms of anti-Semitic hatred seriously and based on the binding provisions of these states.
Thank you. So now that we put a bit of context in what was the situation, what is the legal situation, and what was the situation before 7th of October in Europe, I would like to move on now to what happened since October 7th and what it has been experienced in Europe. We've witnessed several European states engaging with Israel. They've done visits, also many statements related to the conflict. So just for example, I want to say 3 days ago, the Spanish President Pedro Sanchez, he expressed his openness to recognizing a Palestinian state, even in disagreement with the EU. The Belgian Parliament, for instance, also recently declined to screen a video provided by Israel showing the atrocities committed by Hamas on October 7, claiming that it was Israeli propaganda. At the same time, we also see, for instance, I think it was today that the president of Germany, he announced that Germany would donate 7 million euros for the reconstruction of a gallery and a cultural center destroyed in Beirut, which is one of the communities most affected by Hamas attack on October 7th. So, Ambassador Meron, I would like to ask you if you could provide some insights into any shifts, if there was any, in diplomatic relations between Israel and the European Union during the conflict, and if, from your perspective and experience, if you think the Israeli-Hamas war influenced Israel's interaction with individual European states, like, as I mentioned, Spain, or maybe other states like Norway or Germany, even Czech Republic, where you serve as an ambassador.
Thank you very much. I would like to open by saying that the 7th of October is a singular ultimate evil, a massacre that should be recognized and talked about as such, as something really different, something that no other nation has experienced in the last generation or many generations and back until the Holocaust. It is in the one day only, more Jews were killed than any other time since 1945, since the gas chambers stopped working. And this is something that we still have not overcome. And I must say, if I generalize, that the reaction from governments in Europe has been strong, has been a good reaction. On the 15th October, just a week after the massacre in Be'eri, in the rest of the towns around Gaza, the European Council, which is the group of leaders of all of Europe, of 27 countries, got together and issued a very strong statement, which is really the binding statement now for all countries in Europe until today, because this is the highest level of meeting, European Council, and they said that they condemn in the strongest possible terms Hamas and its brutal and indiscriminate terrorist attacks across Israel and deeply deplore the loss of lives. No justification for terror, and they emphasize Israel's right to defend itself in line with humanitarian and international law. And this recognition of Israel's right to defend itself continues now. We heard that we had until now 40 European leaders come to Israel in the last 7 weeks, and they all, with no exception, expressed the Israel's right to defend itself. Of course, there are nuances and differences between different leaders. Maybe the Prime Minister of Czechia and the Prime Minister of Spain don't speak exactly the same wording, but in general, they all say Israel has the right to defend itself and the hostages must be released immediately. Now, you are asking about the different reactions in Europe. So I'm saying that, in generally speaking, the reaction is strong. Now, of course, there are differences because Europe is not one homogeneous group, and on every issue there is differences, and definitely on the Middle East issue. But I would say that the support for Israel is still strong, although the enemy, Hamas, would like to see the opposite. And that is why Hamas, through the Arab countries, through the Muslim countries, through Muslim communities in Europe, and through others, are trying to change the narrative in Europe. They're having major demonstrations there. The demonstrations are led by what I call a red-green alliance. Red being the socialists in very left, not socialists, sorry, extreme left in Europe, together with the Muslim, more extremists amongst the Muslims in Europe. I'm not saying all Muslims are bad. On the contrary, majority of Muslim people are good people. But there are a few that would like to have Europe be very anti-Israel, and they're using demonstrations. In some places, there's even be violence we see. And I don't know if you want to share any, maybe this is the time we can share some photos, Carolina, of, there is a picture there of a demonstration in Paris with people sitting on a statue, and you see the swastika there in the background. No, this is not this one, not this one. Here, yeah, this one. No, go back one. Thank you very much. You see here, using of obvious anti-Semitic signia, like here the swastika in a demonstration in Paris that was last month, and the other signs that we can see. And the attempt is to put pressure on the governments in Europe so they change their position and put pressure on Israel to stop its just fight for defending ourselves and stop our fighting and allow Hamas to come out victorious. So this is the situation. Here's another picture of a demonstration. And yes, so that's my answer to your question.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing with us also these pictures. So now that we touch upon more like the diplomatic sphere and the relations as states and the reactions of the states after October 7th, I would like to ask Dr. Gliszcyńska-Grabias about how this is seen within the populations, not so much in the state level, because we've seen these, like as the pictures that we just saw, like populations that have actively engaged in actions like demonstrations, like other actions too. And we've seen slogans like the one that Ambassador Meron mentioned before, like from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and this is a quote, or expressions like gas the Jews. And we've seen also graffitis proclaiming that Hitler was right. And we've seen also individuals removing the posters featuring hostages' faces. So my question to you, Dr. Gliszcyńska-Grabias, is from your perspective and your experience, how do we navigate this distinction between what's free speech and what expressions qualify as anti-Semitism, especially in what we have seen since October 7th?
Thank you. Actually, the examples you just gave are quite obvious and easy. According to European law and the laws of all the countries where such demonstrations take place, this is a penalized direct call for violence, for hatred. This is incitement to racial, ethnic, national hatred, and all of these forms all of these are crimes according to the criminal codes of the states, of the European states, but also according to the case law of the European Court of Human Rights. That is very rich on various manifestations of racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, xenophobia, and etc. So under all possible definitions and legal attitude towards these examples that you mentioned, this is illegal. And whenever it appears on the streets of European states, the police is under obligation to act immediately and to dissolve such a demonstration. Of course, it can be really difficult with this amount of crowds gathering, but legal consequences must follow every such demonstration of hatred. The problem appears, of course, with more subtle forms of anti-Semitism present during these demonstrations. And here, every single case where there is suspicious that this particular form or a slogan or a chant was anti-Semitic, then this case must be examined and analyzed separately. But there are also problems concerning this cultural code, so to say, as some call it, like exactly the chant "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And here I believe it's crucially important to prepare a kind of a manual or the set of descriptions concerning this kind of slogans translated into all European languages, so that the police, law enforcement, prosecutors offices, etc., they know what particular chants mean. They should know, but to the large extent they do not know. But generally, there are legal tools to react towards hatred that is being widespread and shocking. And I haven't seen this kind of anti-Semitism in Europe in all of the years that I'm dealing with the issue. And it's not only about this legal dimension, but also on a very emotional, personal level. It's shocking, heartbreaking, but I strongly believe in law as a tool of counteracting these forms of hatred.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's very hard also because we know that these tools exist, and sometimes we've seen people saying these kind of slogans, and we've seen that law enforcement officers don't really react to it. So of course, like, besides the question of what tools there are, is who implements it, if anyone, right? We will get to that also soon. And before that, I would like to talk also about regarding these demonstrations and all these actions that we've seen in several European cities. To Ambassador Meron, what challenges have Israeli ambassadors in Europe identified in response to the increasing anti-Semitism? And what strategies or tools do they have at their disposal to effectively address these challenges as Israeli ambassadors that are now working in Europe?
Thank you very much. I'd like to take Sweden as an example. And we have a very able ambassador there, Zbigniew Coleman, and his staff. And they report to us in Israel that the government is very understanding of what happened in Israel and is very much in solidarity with Israel. The media even also is relatively balanced. It is the public opinion and the demonstrations there which are really gone out of it's difficult to you have to be there to feel it. They tell us that there are many anti-Semitic incidents and demonstrations of anti-Semitism in these demonstrations that take place in Stockholm, in Malmo, in other places. So much so that the Jewish community of Sweden feels very, very insecure. Although the government cares about them and tries to help. There was a poll recently that showed that 46% of the Jews in Sweden are thinking if they could, they would immigrate and leave the country, Sweden. They feel insecure in Sweden. And one of the issues there is a legal challenge of freedom of speech, which is embedded strongly in the law in Scandinavia in general, but in Sweden. And you can go, it seems that you can go around and call out these chants like you mentioned before about Palestine and against the Jewish state. And it's very difficult to stop them from saying it and to using these things. And it's to get the government to stop these demonstrations and turn violent, to stop. And it's not only the Muslims that are demonstration, it's also the radical left. And a person who is a very well-known celeb in the world, Greta Thunberg, who people admire because of her activity against for the environment, she has now taken upon herself to demonstrate against Zionism and to defeat Zionism. These are the chants that she's using in these demonstrations. And so you have this. It's challenging to try to understand, to stop it. Now, one of the problems I want to touch about is where you see there is an attempt in many debates in Europe to normalize, so-called normalize, the tragedy that Israel has gone through, and to sort of move on. And the world moves on so quickly. And they use the terms like, let's hear both sides of the story, or there is a cycle of violence. There's no cycle here. Israel was attacked and it's defending itself. There's no both sides of the story. There are the animals, the Hamas, that slaughtered people, butchered them, raped women, and behaved in the most inhumane way. And there is Israel who is trying to defend itself. You know, an Israeli famous commentator on TV, Yonit Levy, I'd like to quote her, and she said that this reminds her, it's like talking about Adolf Eichmann, the figure of the evil, as if you're saying to him, you want to hear what he has to say from his side of the Holocaust. What does he has to say? You don't want to hear his side of the Holocaust, because he perpetuated it. So you don't go to the instigator or the villain and you say, okay, we'd like to hear now your side of the story. So that's what we see happening in different places, in different debates, that we have to be alert and to try to tell people this is not, okay, let's two-side story. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I think maybe people also don't understand that Israel, what it's fighting is against Hamas, right? Not against
the Palestinians and not against the general public. We are out there to take out the military leadership of Hamas that attacked Israel in such a way that they don't have any military capability anymore. That is our goal. And of course, to return the hostages.
Exactly. So before I proceed to the Q&A, the questions from the attendees, which I see we have many already raised, I would like to ask one last question to Dr. Gliszcyńska-Grabias. So now that after what Ambassador Meron said, now from the legal perspective, and as also you mentioned before, how do you think that legal professionals can actually use the tools? Besides the fact that we know that these tools exist, so how can we actually use them to fight against anti-Semitism and also against these concerns, that issues that are not so clear anti-Semitic, or for us maybe they are, but for the European law enforcement officers they aren't. So this question is for you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, I believe we should distinguish between legal professionals being public servants, so to say, so law enforcement, prosecutors, etc., and stress all over again that they are under obligation to act when they see it. The ambassador mentioned the freedom of speech guarantees in Sweden. Of course, they are strong, but at the same time, everywhere in Europe, incitement to hatred and violence is criminalized. So whenever it appears, the action must follow. But equally important is, of course, the reporting of such acts. And it also takes courage, and it takes a lot of effort and resources to report. Not many are ready to do so. But for me, also as a practicing lawyer, going to court, so to say, and also initiating strategic litigation cases is the most important tool to make a difference, to make a change. Because with this kind of litigation, we can set new standards it's really important that these crimes, these hate speech cases, etc., go into statistics that are then being like a proof of what's the scale of anti-Semitism and what has been done on the side of the state in protection of Jewish people, and not only Jewish people, because anti-Semitism affects us all, and it should be seen as such, as affecting and damaging to all members of the society. Unfortunately, it's not the case. But I would like to mention, because you asked what lawyers can do, how can we effectively use these tools? Well, nowadays, unfortunately, first of all, lawyers have to be courageous to take these cases and to keep fighting for the victims of anti-Semitic hatred. It also needs resources, and here this is a huge task for the international community, also community of lawyers, to support each other and help using law as a tool of counteracting anti-Semitism, in particular now. But here I would also mention legal scholars and their responsibility, because what I can observe is a complete, in some circles, of course, I'm not referring to all of legal scholars, but the lack of intellectual and also moral integrity in what they are presenting to the world as their interpretation of human rights law, humanitarian law, etc. It's very corrupt very often, and we have to also look carefully of what is being said within legal academia, because it adds to the rise of anti-Semitism, I'm afraid, on many occasions. So I believe all legal professionals need to unite and need to stay true to what human rights law and fight against racism really means.
Thank you. So now I will, we have many questions from the attendees. Thank you very much to everyone that sent their questions. So I will pick some of them to ask our speakers. So there is one question, very interesting question here, that is, what practical tools or advice could you give to a young adult non-Israeli Jew living in Europe to counteract the narratives demonizing Israel from the so-called progressist left, particularly coming from social media? Ambassador Meron, would you like to answer this question?
Well, first of all, I say to anybody who is interested in the issue and maybe doesn't live here in Israel or is not day-to-day involved in the Middle East, to read up about it, because you have to be knowledgeable, because out there is a lot of fake news. And to talk about where we are today, you have to understand the whole beginning of the state of Israel, when Jews came back to live here more than 100 years ago, what we went through, the pogroms, the Holocaust, the independence war, the 67 war, etc., to see where we are today. So first of all, it's knowledge. It's to read up about it, and there's many books, and there's many organizations, NGOs, that speak up for Israel, and you can help you. But I think the best thing on a day-to-day basis is to read the Israeli media. You can read, it doesn't matter, it could be Israel 21, it could be I-24, it could be the Israeli newspapers, etc. Just read up about what Israel's doing. Make contact with the Israeli embassy in the capital of the country you live in. Ask them to be on a mailing list so you get information about what's happening. Follow in generally, I'd like to say thank you for your interest and your support.
Thank you. I will take on another question. So this one is also a very interesting question. Are there legal precedents where individuals or organizations in IRA member countries have been held accountable for disguising anti-Semitism as criticism of Israel? Dr. Gliszcyńska-Grabias.
There were some attempts in particular countries. I believe there were some cases, even one in France, but I would like to refer to the case law of the European Court of Human Rights that dealt with the BDS movement, which is also part of the anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic, to the large extent, agenda of today. And there were two decisions of the European Court of Human Rights issued so far. One actually stating that BDS and the demand for boycott was a form of discrimination, so not allowed, so to say, very generally. But another decision actually perceived boycott actions as a form of political speech, which is strongly protected under the European Convention of Human Rights. So I would say that the account here is mixed, and it also concerns national jurisdictions. But every time this kind of hatred crosses the line and turning into anti-Semitism, legal actions are possible, and I believe that there will be more to come in the following months because of this what's happening. And I believe that now we will have like real, even though we do not have the precedent system here, but we will have more and more judgments coming concerning exactly this issue, and being and engaging organizations and individuals who are actually crossing this thin red line between legitimate criticism and pure hatred.
Thank you. And we have another question here also on the IRA definition, because it says, if the definition of anti-Semitism of IRA is not binding legally, what is the practical meaning of being a member of IRA regarding fighting anti-Semitism? So maybe Ambassador Meron, could you answer to this question?
I want to take the question, if I can, and just to expand it and say that after the war broke out on the 7th of October, the European special coordinator for combating anti-Semitism, Katharina von Schneyerbein, with the American one, Dr. Deborah Lipstadt, put together a statement condemning what happened, the attack on Israel, in the context of anti-Semitism and hatred. And we have had until now 35 countries that have joined this statement. So that is a tool that has come out of IRA and come out of the special envoys for combating anti-Semitism. You have in many countries special person designated in the government to follow hatred, racism, and anti-Semitism. And many of them have joined this statement. And maybe this is an opportunity to say, we'd like to see more such envoys in every country, that every government should appoint somebody who sits with the prime minister or the foreign minister, or it doesn't matter where he sits, but he has a designated task to follow anti-Semitism as a form of racism, and to report upon it, and to make sure that legislation is there. And maybe another thing that we haven't spoken about much this evening, and that is education. In the education system, to make sure that there's no anti-Semitic material, that there's no anti-Semitic behavior. We have seen in the last few weeks in universities across Europe some very bad behavior taking place there. And that is something that we have to call out and to act against. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would like to ask both of you a last question to finish our discussion today. So after everything we've talked about and we've discussed, I would like to ask you, what changes do you foresee, or if you think they're necessary, any changes in the legal and diplomatic spheres in relation to anti-Semitism, and also regarding the relation of Israel and the EU and European states? And Dr. Gliszcyńska-Grabias.
Thank you. Of course, we should distinguish between, as you said, what should be done and what will be and what will come, or what is expected to come. And I'm afraid that what is expected to come is the further corruption of some even most basic notions within human rights law that normally should be used in defense of the victims of anti-Semitic hatred, but are being abused in order to actually spread anti-Semitism under the notions of fighting for Palestinian rights, which is fully legitimate, and it has nothing to do with what we are talking about today, because fighting for the rights of any group that is a victim of human rights violations is legitimate and rightful, but at the same time, it cannot serve as an excuse to spread hatred against another group, which is in case of Europe a minority group. So this is what I unfortunately expect to be seen and witnessed. And in relation to this, what should be done? We should most strongly stand against these developments. And we should use, again, I'm repeating myself, but for a lawyer, this is actually our strongest weapon, to state all the time the same and to repeat that law needs to be implemented. And here I'm really optimistic when it comes to the EU Commission, not even particular states, because some of the states at their government level behave in a way that is most disturbing. We were mentioning here the Belgian case, or even the Spanish case. But the EU Commission has also legal possibilities to act, and I hope it will. So this is what I fear, and this is what I hope for. Thank you.
So I would like to say that we have seen in the last 7 weeks very dangerous rise in acts of anti-Semitism. I'll just end by giving an example from Austria, where we had a rise of 400% of anti-Semitic incidents from the beginning of the war. 300 actions of anti-Semitic activities against the Jews in Austria. In France, there have been, I think it's around 1,500 incidents from the beginning in the last 7 weeks. Attacks where Jews are afraid to wear the kippah, their head cover, walking around in most countries in Europe today. This is disgraceful that a Jew is afraid to express his Judaism and is so much of concern. And the governments must be aware of it and must fight against it, not succumb to public pressure of demonstrations, etc., but to fight against any signs of anti-Semitism and racism, wherever it be, if it's in the university, in the government, in the newspapers, in the public domain, online. And online is probably the worst place, where we see such hatred and such racist and anti-Semitic activity there. So I think this is an opportunity to say this is the time for governments to act and to strengthen the legislation and be more enforceful of legislation and take the IRA definition very seriously.
Thank you. Thank you very much to both our speakers, Ambassador Daniel Meron and Dr. Aleksandra Gliszcyńska-Grabias, for sharing your insights. I think, unfortunately, many of us are being affected by anti-Semitism in Europe, and this discussion, I believe, was very important, and you encourage all of us to act against anti-Semitism. So thank you for that. And thank you also to our audience for your questions and your participation. Please feel free to send us the questions that we weren't able to answer during the webinar, or if you have any additional questions. And we look forward to seeing you in our next webinar. Thank you very much.